and welcome back to The Wrinkle. Today we're continuing our conversation about sex and seniors. And once again, we have a special guest. We have Natalie Wilton. Hi, Natalie.
Hi.
So just to remind everyone, Natalie is a social worker and a sex therapist, and she predominantly works with seniors. She does work with seniors who are living with dementia and their care partners. She has a private practice as well in counseling and does do a lot of work with people about sexuality. We're so happy to have you back.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
So today we're going to talk about sex and caregiving. What does that mean? First of all, if somebody says to you, I'm a caregiver, what does that mean to you, Natalie?
Some people they don't like the term caregiver, but when I'm talking about a caregiver, I'm thinking about somebody that is providing support to somebody in some of their daily needs, and maybe that might be something physical, or it might also be something emotional or cognitive if we're talking about someone with dementia.
Okay, and you said some people don't like that term caregiver. Where does that come from?
Sometimes people don't identify with the word caregiver, and some people prefer the term care partner. That's starting to be used more frequently. Some people, it just doesn't fit for them. But I'll probably use the word caregiver as we talk about this, just so we're all sort of understanding the same word.
Some people I've heard that care partner implies more of that reciprocal relationship, right? Rather than the one person doing all the giving and the other doing all the receiving.
Yep.
So, but what are the types of caregiving? Like, what's the spectrum there?
Well, it can run from physical caregiving. So if the person you're caring for has more physical needs, and maybe you're helping them with mobility concerns, and things that meet their physical day-to-day needs, or if you're someone caring for someone with dementia, you're looking more after their cognitive needs, and you're actually sometimes running the show. You're thinking of all aspects of the relationship.
I know what you mean, that the cognitive needs, and a lot of it is running the show, as you put it. So especially when we think of dementia, apathy is the most common behavioral symptom of dementia, right? So a lot of people feel like they're the cruise director and they have to have this roster of activities to keep everything on an even keel. And that is a big responsibility.
Exactly. It can be very exhausting.
It's tiring. And the physical caregiving. And sometimes there's a mix of both of those things.
Exactly.
Then how does this affect sexuality? Should we just assume that once a person in a partnership becomes the caregiver, that's it? It's sex is over?
Absolutely not. When you're a caregiver, you're a sexual being from the time you're born, really. You don't necessarily emerge that way, but and you will have a sexual identity before you were a caregiver, during the caregiving journey, and if your caregiving journey ends, you will still have a sexual identity. So it's important to acknowledge that and recognize that we have sexual needs, and those are important.
Because you know what? I got to say, Natalie, I don't hear a lot of talk about sex in the office. So I do see a lot of, practically every person I see who's living with dementia has a care partner, and a lot of times they're married and they don't sort of bring, I'm not meeting my sexual needs. That just doesn't come up. So do you think people see that as important in their lives?
I don't know if they do, and I wish they would. I think people maybe put that aside and think it's not important, and they're so busy thinking of those other things that they forget. And then I think maybe people don't ask about it and talk about it and give that space to talk about it.
Which you mentioned last time in part one. If you that sticks in my head, you said, if you ask, people will tell, but you gotta ask. What's wrong with just not asking and sort of ignoring the sexuality? Like what?
Well, I think we miss out on people and their needs, and looking at something like what we would call a disenfranchised grief. So that's a grief that's not acknowledged for people. And we also use the term in caregiving, ambiguous loss. So that's the kind of loss that is constantly happening, and it's frequent for people with dementia because they're constantly losing little pieces of their person that they're caring for. With sex, it's never acknowledged. So frequently people say in caregiving groups, they don't talk about sex. And then even when their partner passes away, people often don't ask, hey, what are you missing about your sex life? It's just not something that's talked about so much. So it's a gap for people, and I think it's something that's missing. studies have shown that people would like to talk about it, but just don't. So it's important.
And you know what? You've brought up a couple times that when the person passes away, there's that gap. And we talk so much about advanced care planning. A lot of it is around the physical care. We don't necessarily say, so how are you going to be a wife when you're living in different homes? What's that like? Or planning ahead for your sexual health when you become single again after 50, 60 years sometimes.
It's so hard to be near you.
We say that caregiving has an impact on your sex life and your sexuality. What are some of those other changes?
Sex is so value laden. So it's important to think about that and think about where our views about sexuality come from. It could be our sexual education. It could be the values that we grew up with. Sex can affect caregiving depending on what the state of the relationship was like before caregiving started.
Yeah, that's big. Where are we starting from? Because some people have had, there's a variety of ways that sexuality can manifest in a relationship.
Yep, exactly. And the other piece is I think that something that gets missed by a lot of providers and just in society in general, we always portray caregiving as a loving endeavor. And it's not always. And I think it's important to understand that for people, because for some people, caregiving, they do and they love it, and it's, they do it with all their heart. And for some people, when they get to the stage where they're caregiving for somebody, it's not for them, and it's very difficult. And sometimes some people feel somewhere in between, and it changes throughout the caregiving journey, and people ought not to feel guilty for where they position themselves on that spectrum.
I do see some resentment, and it's usually directed at the disease itself. Like, why is this happening? This isn't fair. This wasn't what we planned in this relationship. For sure, there's resentment and grief, as you mentioned. And the role changes, doesn't it? When you're a care partner, the role goes from being a partner, as we think of sort of an intimate partner, and now being kind of like a parent sometimes, eh?
Exactly. And that can be one of the specific challenges. It's trying to find that control. People are trying to find the get control of their whole day when they're caregiving, and so then they fall into that parent role, and it's hard to feel sexy after you've spent the rest of your day in that parent type role.
Then the other thing is probably just the practical things that you miss about intimacy, the release that you can get from having sex.
Absolutely.
Even the physical activity. What other things are there that people might not even realize they're lacking, but they do lack when they kind of put the sex life on the back burner in the caregiving?
Well, sex can be relaxing. It can be good for you emotionally. It releases good hormones and good chemicals to make us feel emotionally well. And it's a sense of comfort, and touch is important. And often that touch changes with caregiving. We go from more of a intimate touch, like an affectionate touch, to more of an instrumental touch, in the sense that we're physically doing something for somebody. We're helping them get dressed, we're helping them bathe. So then maybe it becomes difficult to shift into that hugging for affection's sake.
Okay, that's a term I hadn't heard. So instrumental touch. You're not touching just because you enjoy the pleasure of it or the sensuality of it. It's for a reason. And that doesn't sound too sexy.
So maybe that means when you're washing somebody, that you rub their back a little bit longer. You give them maybe a cream massage, and just trying to find those moments of affection where you can add affection into those instrumental pieces.
Okay. The fatigue is probably a part of it too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And you mentioned a few minutes ago some of those big emotions like guilt and resentment. Those kinds of things can be very difficult to deal with, and you're drained at the end of the day. And women struggle too with that. Libido almost has a 24-hour cycle, right?
Okay.
It's not necessarily in the 24 minutes before sex. It's in the 24 hours ahead of it. When you've been caregiving and working hard for 24 hours and the 24 hours before that, it can be really hard to feel sexy and feel like being intimate.
That's a great point. I don't think we talked about that last time. So yeah, the 24 hours. So you need a lot of foreplay, and it can start, the day before when somebody mops the floor for you or
Exactly.
or picks up that thing that you needed from the store and didn't feel like getting. Okay. And then the other question is that as the person who has cognitive impairment, sometimes that can affect drive. Sometimes it can increase the drive or just create a mismatch. So what's the best way for a caregiver to deal with that mismatch, one way or the other?
It's about, I guess, identifying what the need is in that situation. So I've had caregivers tell me that now their husband's more interested in sex than they have ever been when they've had dementia. And so that's been a positive for them. For people where it increases their drive and that's not a happy thing, it's about trying to find other strategies and solutions, outlets for that, for the person. In dealing with the mismatch, again, that's looking at finding different outlets to meet each person's need.
Help somebody to address some of these challenges when they're in a caregiving role, their partner is living with dementia. What are some of the things that they can try to do to bring some of that intimacy back?
One of the things you can do is try to change maybe the way you're looking at sex. So try to take the focus off of performance and look more towards pleasure. Focus more on getting those comfort things out of intimacy, the feelings of love and affection, those relaxation aspects that you can get out of intimacy, rather than feel that there's a performance issue that needs to happen. If I was seeing somebody that wasn't necessarily a caregiver in sex therapy, they were sort of mismatched with their partner and having trouble connecting, we would tell them to take sex off the table and just focus on some other things first. And so that's, what you could do in this case as well. Just focus more on those caring, loving touch, relaxing touch, as opposed to actual trying to feel like you need to have sex all the time.
Again, it comes back to what you said. You have to almost take a history of what has your sex life been like.
That's right.
What were you doing? So if it was very much focused on a specific act that has changed a lot, people are going to have to totally reframe it.
That's right.
Yeah, to even think of it as sex.
Yep. Exactly. And maybe put a bit more focus on yourself and your own needs, and look at solo sex.
Okay.
Masturbation is good for you.
Yeah.
People don't necessarily think about that and think, oh, that's not something that I want to do, but it's good for you. And it's an important, we talked about it before, that use it or lose it. It's a good thing.
So if your partner's performance has changed and so the act is different now and involves other parts of the body, it's important as a caregiver to maybe pay attention to those parts that aren't getting attention. And you might have to take care of that yourself.
That's right.
And so we talked last time about ways to do that, and that's okay. To do those things.
It is okay, yeah.
And it's okay to ask about it, too, if you
okay.
need some guidance. Like, would a sex therapist maybe give specific guidance about what to do or how to start?
Absolutely.
And so it's okay to have solo sex, but let's talk about something that is kind of touchy. What about turning outside of the relationship to satisfy those needs? That does happen. I've definitely met, and I can think of a few people in my practice the partner is living with dementia, and the care partner will be with a new partner, but sometimes that new partner takes on the caregiving role for the person with dementia, and it becomes sort of a triad. I think it's hard to see the fault in that, although many people would. I guess, and some people don't separate from the marriage first. Some people would stay married, but then take on this other partner. So where do you see that in your practice?
Absolutely. It is a big thing, and it goes both ways. And what I think is common is that people talk about what... If you and your spouse would talk and say, well, if I were to pass away, I'd be okay with you repartnering. Or even if you don't actually have that talk, you have a sense. Like, I think my husband would be okay if I remarried somebody if he died. But what we don't talk about is, what if we're still living? What if we are cognitively unwell and I'm living in a nursing home and you meet somebody else? Is it okay to go outside of that relationship? And there's no perfect answer for that, but I think that people do, and because people have different needs, and sometimes it's a companionship need. Sometimes people just want somebody to have dinner with. Sometimes they want somebody to hold their hand in a scary movie. They want somebody to have a conversation with, because as caregiving needs increase, the conversation stops. Caregivers talk about that all the time. And I'm sure you hear that a lot in your practice. There's no conversation. So there's lots of reasons why people go outside the marriage. And I think people do it for their own reasons. And I think that has to be okay for them. It has to be okay if that's okay for you.
The hard part there is probably the other family members that are going to judge, right? Let's be honest. The kids get uncomfortable if they feel like mom is betraying dad.
Yep.
Right?
And children, adult children, even your previous values and beliefs, that may come into conflict with what you previously held as a value. For some people, their faith is, dictates what their values would be in that respect. So people deal with a lot of conflict, and that's a lot of what we talk about in sex therapy, is those emotional things as well. And how do we resolve that conflict for ourselves?
And the intimacy, right? Because I think people might be more understanding if somebody were to go to a sex worker or a sex surrogate. So I think people might have an easier time understanding the sex aspect, the actual physical sex, but like you say, the conversation, the having dinner, the flirting, the getting dressed up for somebody because they're going to notice it. That intimacy is maybe harder for other people to see. What if the person who has the cognitive impairment gets into a new relationship?
That is a frequent occurrence in, care facilities where the person with dementia doesn't recognize their spouse and they repartner with somebody else. And that can be very challenging as a caregiver to see as well.
There have been movies about that,
There's
right?
been
Wasn't
movies
that
about
movie?
Yep.
So what would I guess we all have our own sort of value judgments about that, right? But how do we sort of frame that? Like, how would you talk to families about that? If they hear that because it might be okay with the partner, right? It might be okay with the wife to say, okay, well, he's got a girlfriend in long-term care and I'm his wife.
It's a lot of understanding dementia and understanding how, what the changes in the brain are and why those things are happening, and understanding what it's about and what it's not about. It's not always about, it's not about hurting somebody. People tend to frame it as an infidelity and it's hurtful, but it's not about that with someone with dementia. It becomes about a need. It becomes that need for companionship, that need for warmth, that need for human touch, and that not recognition of who their spouse is.
I guess the other thing that people might ask about is the ethical issue. So if there is agnosia for the spouse, so if they don't recognize the partner. So suppose it's a lady who's living with cognitive impairment and she doesn't recognize her husband, but he still wants to have intimacy with her. And is that ethical for him to go ahead and try to initiate something?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a big question I think people struggle with, and it's a moment by moment decision. I think it's interaction by interaction, and we can't make a blanket statement about whether it's okay or not. It has to be about reading the cues in the moment. And certainly there's no blanket consent, and even consent for spouses.
Yeah.
So we can't just say, because it's my spouse, I therefore have the right to have
Right.
sex with that person.
Yeah, we don't say that under any circumstance.
That's right. And we need to remember that in this case too.
I think that's a great way of putting it. There's no blanket yes or no, and you have to trust that within that relationship and knowing the couple knowing each other, that the person who doesn't have impairment will be able to read those cues and to act in a respectful way. So the answer is it depends.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, situation by situation.
I've been running down the empty streets, blindfolded by misbeliefs. I've been back to where we met, all the moments and regrets. I've been searching empty alleys, called your name out in the prairies. The sunlight shades, but what remains is the shade of you. I gotta hold on. The memories are here, but you are gone. You say we're through, it's true, me and you. Your painful words distract the view. Don't you feel it too? In the search for you, I'll pursue.
So it sounds like it's okay to bring up your sexuality when you're talking about caregiving. And it doesn't just have to be about the other aspects of it, like the physical caregiving. It's okay to bring your sexual needs into it and to deal with them. What if caregivers don't deal with their sexual health?
Well, sexual health is important, and it's a part of our whole well-being. It's included in our physical, our emotional well-being. So if we don't deal with it, it's neglecting an important aspect of our life and our identity.
You have a real interest in this caregiver sexuality, right? So tell me more about why you're interested in that.
Well, you know what? There's not enough information out there that talks about sex and what it's like to have a sexual identity and be a caregiver at the same time. Those are often two conflicting ideas, but they can be both true. What I am interested in finding out is more about what caregivers' perspectives are and hearing their stories. In doing a personal research project where I'm interviewing caregivers and really just hearing their stories about being a sexual being, and not the literature that does exist tends to frame it from a negative or frame it from a how to deal with this behavior. And I think that has a place and that's important. But I want to hear about what it's like to be a caregiver, to have a sexual identity, and how do you deal with that? How do you manage that?
That is very interesting. And you're right. When I was preparing this interview, I thought, well, I better bone up on some of this caregiver sexuality. And there was very little. There was a lot of stuff, as you say, about dementia, the changes in dementia or cognitive impairment, how the person living with dementia sexuality changes, but not a lot about caregivers. So there is a lack of info. There is. And that would be very helpful. So you're interviewing caregivers.
It's about an hour-long interview. I'm looking to meet with someone for an hour at a time that's convenient for them. It's completely confidential. No identifying information will be used. It's just about gathering someone's story and helping to educate others about what it's like to be a caregiver and also a sexual being.
So if people want to participate in that, how would they get in touch with you?
Through my website, wiltontherapy.com, or they could email me at natalie@wiltontherapy.com.
And I will put those on the description box underneath where the podcast is published. Well, Natalie, is there anything we haven't covered? Like, this is a big topic and we want to talk about some other aspects of it for sure. So we wanted to keep this somewhat encapsulated.
Right.
What have we not covered?
just some sort of general tips, I guess, for caregivers. So thinking from a physical caregiving point of view, and we didn't talk a lot about that, but someone who is a caregiver for someone with more physical needs, they have needs as well. And I think strategies around communication would be more effective for somebody with physical caregiving needs. And it's important to recognize regardless of what kind of caregiver you find yourself being, your needs are important as well. I think that you need to look for intimacy in other ways. We've talked a lot about that today, and sex is not all or nothing, and it's not just about intercourse. Sex can be lots of different things, and it's about finding new ways to do old things.
And you say be nice to yourself and kind of be compassionate to yourself and be compassionate to other people too, because we've talked about a few examples where others might be quick to judge about somebody bringing up that they have sexual needs or trying to satisfy those sexual needs. And just don't judge other care partners who are in that boat. Right?
Exactly.
Be nice to each other.
Exactly.
Because we don't know. We really don't know what discussions a couple has had or just what's going on.
That's right. And we don't know what we would, until we're walking in that exact situation, we don't know what we would do. So, be kind to our fellow caregivers. And even when you're a professional, reserving that judgment, right? When you're working with couples and you find out that one of them is in a relationship with somebody else outside of the marriage, or you're at the grocery store and you run into somebody who you're maybe caring for their spouse in long-term care. Be careful with your judgments on those.
Very good advice. Yeah, especially where we live. It's a bit of a small town. You see your patients all over the place. So it's good to not, just reserve judgment. That's good advice for life, eh? Yeah, and it's good advice here. I would encourage anyone who is a care partner and wants to talk to Natalie. She's very easy to talk to. And I think this is a really worthy project. And I would love to help out in any way I can and would anxiously await the results as well. So do contact Natalie for the Caregiver Sexuality Discovery Project. You can reach her at wiltontherapy.com is her website. And also email at natalie@wiltontherapy.com. But Natalie, I want to thank you for coming back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I hope you'll come back again because this is only part 2. I think we have so much more to talk about sex and seniors. I hope you enjoyed episode 2 of Sex and Seniors, where we talked about sex and the caregiver with Natalie Wilton, sex therapist and social worker. Please join in the conversation on The Wrinkle. You can find us at Facebook at The Wrinkle 2, also on Twitter at The Wrinkle 2, or send an email, wrinklechat@gmail.com. And of course, you can find all of our videos and this podcast on YouTube. I'm Dr. Nicole Diddick. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Wrinkle.